The wolf did not move when the search team emerged from the tree line. It was crouched low in the open field, its gray and white body half swallowed by a drift that had built up overnight against a collapsed section of the old fence. When the first man spotted the shape and raised his hand to stop the others, nobody spoke. They stood at the edge of the field and watched, their breath rising in short white columns, and the wolf did not run. It did not circle or lower its head in warning. He would spend the next 3 years trying to explain to people who were not there. He would say it wasn't the wolf's stillness, exactly, though that was part of it. He would say it wasn't even the fact that the animal refused to leave, though that was part of it too. What stopped him? What stopped all 6 of them in that field at 7 in the morning on the 4th day of the search was what the wolf was crouched over. Because beneath the wolf, barely visible in the packed snow, something was breathing. What that thing was, and what it meant for the family waiting at the edge of the field road in a pickup truck with the engine running, would become one of those stories that a county holds onto for a long time, turning it over like a stone in the hand, trying to figure out if it says something about the world or only about the particular morning it happened. People who were there will tell you different things. But the one thing they all agree on, all 6 of them, is that the wolf looked at Harlan Voss and did not run, and that the look meant something they didn't have words for. 3.5 days earlier, Leif was 44 years old and had been living on that 11-acre parcel outside the town of Orrin, North Dakota, for going on 7 years. He had bought the place the year his wife Deanna died, when the apartment they'd shared in Bismarck had started to feel like a container for things he could no longer hold. He'd been looking for distance, the particular kind of distance that comes from having something real to do with your hands in the morning, and the property had found him almost accidentally through a listing his brother sent as a joke. And there were mornings when he stood on the back step with coffee and watched the field change from purple to gold to white, and thought, without quite being able to finish the thought, that Deanna would have liked it here. He had gotten Briar 6 months after moving in. She was a mixed breed rescue from the shelter in Garrison, part Labrador and part something broader chested and longer legged that the intake form had listed only as unknown. She was 7 months old when life brought her home, already too large for a lapdog, and still pretending she didn't know it. She had a torn left ear, a wound from her time before the shelter that had healed imperfectly into a notch of scar tissue along the upper rim. The shelter tech had apologized for it, the way shelter workers apologize for the things they couldn't fix. Leif had told her not to worry. He had told his daughter Wren about Briar on the phone that evening. Wren was 15 and lived with Deanna's mother in Fargo during the school year. Arrangement made in the months after the funeral that had calcified into something permanent, the way grief arrangements often do. She asked what kind of dog, and Leif had said mixed, mostly lab, very friendly. She asked if it was a boy or a girl. He said girl. There was a pause on the phone, and then Wren had said, good, and that had been the beginning of things. Briar became the reason Wren came to visit. Not the only reason. Life knew, and not the reason she would have given if asked. But from the first weekend, she arrived and sat on the kitchen floor with Briar's oversized head in her lap, something between them relaxed that had been tight for a long time. Leif had watched it happen from the doorway, not wanting to disturb it, his daughter's hand moving slowly through the dog's fur, the dog's tail moving in a slow, satisfied arc, the kitchen bright with late September light. He had not let himself cry then. He cried later, in the barn, over nothing in particular. Briar was 3 years old on the day the storm came. She had never once tried to leave the property in all that time, which was why he stood in the doorframe for a long moment without moving. The wind was picking up. The sky was the non-color that means a real storm, not the picturesque kind, but the kind that erases things. He had gone to bed with the weather radio running and a forecast that had said 6 to 8 inches by midday, which was manageable. The wind took the sound and did something sideways with it. He called again. She did not come. He told himself she had gone out to use the yard and gotten turned around by the wind, the way dogs sometimes do, losing their orientation in weather. He told himself she was under the porch, sheltering. He put on his coat and boots and went out into it, calling her name, visibility to 30 feet. He searched the yard. He searched the barn, though the barn was latched and there was no way she'd gotten in. He searched along the fence line on the north and east sides of the property, calling until his throat felt raw. The post was down, and the lowest wire had been bent outward. Beyond it, the field extended in every direction under falling snow, white and featureless and enormous. He stood at the gap in the fence, and the storm pushed at him. He called her name one more time. Nothing. Leaf went back inside and called his neighbor Gus Tortle, whose property bordered his on the east side. And Gus came over with his truck, and they drove the section roads for 2 hours in worsening weather, the two of them calling out of rolled-down windows into a storm that was now in its serious phase. They found nothing. By noon the roads were closed, and the county was issuing shelter-in-place advisories, and Gus drove home through field roads that would be impassable within the hour. He did not fully believe this, but he told himself anyway. He called Wren that evening. She was supposed to come up for the long weekend starting Friday, 4 days away. He told her what had happened, keeping his voice level, because Wren had been through enough. Wren listened without speaking. At the end she asked, "Do you think she's okay?" Leaf said yes. He said it the same way he'd learned to say things to his daughter, which was to say them in the direction of truth rather than to the truth itself, because sometimes the direction is all you have to offer. After he hung up, he sat in the kitchen for a while in the dark. The storm ran for 2 full days. It dropped 19 inches on Orrin and the surrounding county, a late-season event that collapsed 2 outbuildings, knocked out power across 4 townships, and killed 30 head of cattle on the Brant farm 12 miles south when their barn roof gave. The county was not equipped for what it received, and the full opening of roads took until the morning of day 3. By then, life had not slept properly in 40 hours. He had called animal control, both neighboring counties' shelters, the regional humane organization, and 3 neighbors in every direction. He had posted on every local Facebook group and the county emergency board. He had stood at the gap in his fence in every lull in the storm and called until his voice went rough and then rougher. The gap itself he had temporarily closed with a length of wire he found in the barn, an act that felt in the moment like closing a door after a fire, something you did because it was the only thing you could do, not because it changed anything. He went through photographs on his phone with no purpose, except to be near something. The torn ear was visible at the edge of the frame, catching afternoon light. He put the phone face down on the table. He thought about how a person organizes themselves around something small without realizing it. How a routine built around a dog, the 5:30 morning walk, the after-dinner circuit of the fence line, the specific sound of paws on the kitchen floor at night, becomes the architecture of a day, and how without it the day has no shape, just duration. He had learned this once before, with a different absence. He had not expected to have to learn it again. Wren had called 4 times. He had kept his voice level each time. Drove over personally in response to a missing dog report that had escalated through 3 different channels because of who Leaf Calloway was in the community. What he found was a man who had clearly not slept, sitting on his back step in a barn coat, looking out at the field. Harlan had known life for most of his time in Orrin. He knew what the man had been through before he came here. He said it not with great confidence, but because the alternative was to say nothing, and sometimes the action is what matters, not the likelihood. Leaf thanked him without meeting his eyes. Harlan noticed, when he stood to go, that the back door was still ajar. He did not say anything about it. Wren arrived that evening. She had taken a bus from Fargo, and Life had driven to pick her up at the depot in Orrin, and they drove home mostly in silence, Wren with her arms folded and her face toward the window. She was almost 16 now, 3 months from it, and she had her mother's way of holding herself when she was working through something, a particular stillness in the shoulders that Leaf had spent years learning to read. He did not push, he drove. And the sky was that specific January blue that comes after a storm, clean and very cold and absolute. At the house, Wren went upstairs without eating. Leaf heard her moving around up there for a while, the way she used to move around as a little girl when she was upset and didn't want to be asked about it. Then it went quiet. He sat at the kitchen table and listened to the quiet. The search team assembled at 7 the following morning. There were 8 of them in total, Harlan and 2 other deputies, Gus Tortle, which was a decision he'd reflect on later. Wren had come downstairs in her coat and said she was coming too, and neither of them had argued with her, which was a decision both of them would reflect on later. They spread across Left's north field in a line and walked. The cold was significant. It was -11 before the wind, and the wind was coming steady out of the northwest at 15, which meant exposed skin was a concern within minutes. The team was prepared. They walked slowly, probing drifts with poles, calling at intervals, the sound of Breyer's name moving out ahead of them and dissipating into the open. The field absorbed the sound the way deep cold absorbs everything, taking it flat, giving nothing back. Not a track, not a disturbance in the snow, not a mark of any kind. As if the land was declining to be rid. Harlan moved up beside Leif at one point and said, quiet enough not to carry, that they'd do the section land next and work it north. Leif nodded. He had been telling himself, for most of those 90 minutes, the same thing he'd been telling himself for 4 days, that she was somewhere, that somewhere was findable, that the act of looking was the same as the act of finding, which he knew was not true, and told himself anyway, because the only alternative was to stop looking. The search moved north and then northeast, crossing the Callaway property line onto the unfenced section that bordered it, a stretch of flat, unimproved land that the county owned and that no one had any immediate use for. This was terrain the dog might have reached, given the direction of the gap in the fence and the northwest wind that would have pushed her. The snow here was undisturbed in most places, smooth and sculpted by the storm into long parallel dunes, and the searchers moved through it in single file where it was deepest. It was one of the Fenwick brothers, a younger one whose name was Cale, who first stopped. He stood still and looked, and then he raised his hand, and the line stopped. At the far side of the field, where the remnants of an old fence line made a ragged dark line against the snow, there was a shape. It was low and gray, and it was not moving. Harlan said nothing for a moment. He looked at the shape the way a person looks at something they are trying to fit into a category and cannot find the right one. Then quietly, he told the team to hold. He brought his binoculars up. The shape resolved. Gray and white, long-bodied, the characteristic shoulder height, ears up and forward. Looking directly at him, he lowered the binoculars slowly. Once at distance on a highway median, gone before his truck fully stopped. Once in a livestock complaint photograph, a blurred image on a game camera that could have been a wolf or a large coyote and was officially logged as the latter. What he was looking at now, through binoculars at 140 feet in January morning light, was neither of those things. It was a wolf, fully adult, in good condition, with the kind of still measured watchfulness that wild predators have when they have decided to hold their ground. The team waited. What he said next was simply that they needed to approach slowly and without noise, and that nobody was to make any sudden movement, and that if the animal ran, there was nothing they could do about it. He did not say the word wolf because Leif and Ren were standing 20 feet behind him, and the word would carry. And he wanted to understand what was happening before that conversation needed to happen. They walked toward the shape in a slow line. As they walked, the shape grew clearer and more impossible. It was a large wolf, an adult, its coat thick with winter. It was crouched in a way that suggested it had been in this position for some time. The snow around it disturbed and packed, a circular area that spoke of hours, not minutes. It watched them come. It did not run. It did not posture. It watched. Harlan stopped the team at 60 feet, and they stood. The wolf held its ground. Then, slowly, without taking its eyes from the approaching line of humans, it shifted its weight, just slightly. The shift was lateral, a few inches, and what it exposed, at the base of the drift beneath it, was a partial view of something dark against the snow, something that was breathing. At 30 feet, he could see enough. At 20, he stopped. He turned to the team, and then he turned to Leif, and he saw on Leif's face that Leif was already reading him, already reading the turn, and he said it before Leif could move. He said, "She's alive," placing itself at a new angle from which it could observe without being between Leif and the ground. Leif registered this and moved past it and dropped to his knees in the snow. Briar was alive in the way a candle is alive inside cupped hands. Barely, and because of something surrounding it. Her body was curled on its side, pressed against the base of the drift where the collapsed fence post had created a shallow depression. A few inches of windbreak, it was the difference between exposure and shelter. Her coat was ice-matted along the outer surfaces and dry and warmer beneath, close to the skin, where something larger than her had been lying. She was breathing. Each breath arrived with a slight delay, as if each one required a decision. Her eyes were partially open, showing a thin crescent of dark iris, and they moved, barely, when Leif's hand found her side. Just moved, barely. Ren was behind him. "She said the ear, Dad. That's the ear, which has its own particular shape and is its own more complicated thing." Leif gathered Briar against his coat and stood. The wolf watched. Gus Tordal had a blanket in his pack, the emergency kind, and he passed it forward without a word. The wolf stood at 12 feet and watched them go. Nobody spoke to it or toward it. Nobody made any motion in its direction. They simply moved quickly now, Leif with the wrapped dog against his chest, and Ren at his side with her hand on his arm, and the wolf stood in the open field and watched them until the tree line closed between them, and it was gone. In the truck on the way to the emergency veterinary clinic in Garrison, Ren sat in the back with Briar across her lap, both of them wrapped in the silver emergency blanket, and she did not speak. Leif drove. Harlan had radioed ahead. The roads were clear. The sky above them was the brutal clean blue of a morning after, and the fields on either side were blank and white and enormous. He knew the gap was in the northeast corner, which was when a dog without shelter would have become critical. He knew the collapsed fence section where they had found her was roughly 3/4 of a mile from the gap northeast. What he could not construct, and what he would never be able to construct, was the rest of it. Because what the veterinarian told him, 3 hours later, in a small room off the treatment bay, while Ren sat in the waiting area with a cup of bad coffee going cold in her hands, was that Briar's core temperature when she arrived was low enough to indicate she had not been generating adequate body heat on her own for a significant period. That she had survived this was, in the vet's clinical language, unlikely. The vet was a precise and careful person who did not deal in miracles. She said that the degree of shelter from wind and precipitation that the dog had been afforded, and the degree of ambient warmth from an external source, in the absence of which the outcome would almost certainly have been different. She said this carefully, looking at her notes. She said, "Is there any indication of what might have provided that?" Leaf looked at her. He said yes. The vet looked up from her notes. He said, "A wolf." There was a pause in that small room that was longer than it needed to be for simple comprehension. The vet had practiced in rural North Dakota for 19 years. She had treated animals harmed by wildlife, treated wildlife caught in farm equipment, navigated the complicated overlap of wild and domestic that defines that landscape. She was not a sentimental person. She looked at Leif across her desk for a long moment, and then she looked back at her notes, and she wrote something down, and she said, "That would explain the ambient heat." She did not say anything beyond that. There are things in that part of the world, not because the explanation isn't available, but because the explanation, when fully traced, tends to arrive at a question that the explanation cannot close. The way the collapsed fence drift had created a natural windbreak that any large animal might have found useful in a storm. None of these explanations were wrong. None of them, individually or together, fully closed the question of why a wild wolf had remained crouched over an unconscious domestic dog for what the team's assessment suggested was somewhere between 20 and 40 hours. That was the number Harlan Voss arrived when he did his own reconstruction carefully over the week following the search. He was not prone to the kind of thinking that reaches for the inexplicable when the explicable is available. That the animal appeared to have remained with the domestic dog for an extended period in extreme cold, providing insulation, and that this behavior was unusual. He wrote unusual. He thought about other words and decided on unusual. Wren stayed through the following week, past the end of her planned visit. She stayed while Briar was inpatient, and then she stayed for the first 3 days after Briar came home. She slept in Leaf's guest room and came downstairs each morning to sit on the kitchen floor with Briar, who was healing slowly, eating cautiously, but coming back to herself in the incremental way that animals do, without drama, cell by cell. And she sat across from him and pulled her knees up and said, without preamble, "I want to stay through the semester." Leaf looked at her. She said, "If that's okay." He said, "You'd have to change schools." She said, "I know." He said, "Your grandmother." She said, "I already called her last night." She said, "Okay." Leaf looked at his daughter across the table. Neither of them, something forged in the years since the funeral out of everything she'd had to be without. He thought about the kitchen in September, 4 years ago, Wren on the floor with a new dog's head in her lap. There is one more thing about that field. Harlan Voss went back to it twice. The first time was for the report, to photograph the site and document the measurements. The second time he went alone, on a Sunday in early February, 2 weeks after the search, on a morning that was clear and still and very cold. The site was largely undistinguishable by then. The snow had fallen again, and then melted partially in a warm stretch and refrozen, and the specific drift where they had found Briar was smoothed over. Just another irregularity in the terrain. He had told the story at the station, carefully, factually, without editorial. He had told it to his brother-in-law on the phone, and his brother-in-law had said, "Come on." He had said, "I know." His brother-in-law had said, "You're sure it was a wolf?" He had said yes. He thought about the way the wolf had looked at him across the field, that first long moment when neither side moved. He thought about a word he had written in a report and decided to keep small. He looked out at the open field, at the enormous flat land, at the sky sitting on top of it with all its weight, just the fact of it, sitting in a person's chest, getting carried forward. He turned and walked back to his truck. By March, she was running the fence line again, which Leif had repaired in early February, the post reset and the wire tight. Without announcing it, began to consider it home. She and Briar developed a specific evening ritual that involved the couch and a particular pillow arrangement that excluded Leif on principle and included him by default. And he would sit at the other end of the couch with a book he rarely read and listened to his daughter talk to the dog in the low, continuous murmur that people use when they are telling the truth to something that cannot repeat it. There was no more news of the wolf. Harlan had reached out to the state wildlife division, and they had noted the report without particular alarm. Gray Wolf Range in North Dakota, being a subject of ongoing documentation, and the sighting being consistent with established territory. Nothing further was reported in the area that season. In April, Wren found a photograph on her phone that she had taken the previous November on a visit before the storm. In it, Briar was lying in a shaft of afternoon light on the kitchen floor, her head turned toward the camera, the torn left ear catching the light in a way that made the scar tissue look almost silver. Wren looked at the photo for a long time. She didn't show it to Leaf right away. She kept it on her phone and looked at it at intervals over the following days. The way you look at a thing that means something you don't have full language for yet. She showed it to him eventually, on a Tuesday evening in late spring, when the kitchen windows were open for the first time and the field outside was turning green. The land doing what flat land does when the season turns, filling with color so fast it looks like time has sped up. Leaf held the phone and looked at the photo. He looked at the torn ear. He gave the phone back and didn't say anything. And Wren didn't say anything either. And outside the window, the field went on in every direction, big and quiet and full of a spring that neither of them had been entirely sure 5 months earlier they would reach. The wolf was never seen near that property again. But on the morning, Harlan had stood in the field before he turned to walk back. He had looked down at the snow around his boots and noticed something he had not noted in his report because he had not known, in that moment, what to do with it. Heading back into whatever it had come from, as if it had finished something, as if it had known from the beginning exactly how long to stay.